Co-far? More like co-anticlimactic. Yeah, that's the best joke I could think of to start off this review. Don't judge me! Hello, interwebs! I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of Star Wars The Acolyte. This one, episode 4, titled Day. And apologies up front for the kind of lo-fi setup today for this review. Normally I would record at my computer desk or, you know, another set that I'm doing. But right now, at the moment, my computer is kind of being taken up as it's exporting the gigantic 500 gigabyte file of my movie Identities. Because we have the premiere in less than a week. Yeah, the next time that I review a Star Wars episode, I will have premiered my movie. So right now I'm just exporting that giant file so that we can show it in a theater. So my computer is chugging along right now if I try to do anything else on it, and I don't want to screw with that export. So you're just gonna get me sitting here recording on my phone in this beautiful woods. I'm definitely really in the woods right now. That's how you know it's true, because I said it. Also, quickly on the note before I get into the official review, just to mention, as I just said, my movie Identities is coming out next week on Tuesday, actually right at the time the Acolyte airs, so you can choose between the Acolyte or my movie at 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern time on Nebula. Just last time I'll talk about this a few more times over the coming weeks, but this has been a real important project to me, and honestly, it's hopefully a pilot episode for a TV show. We're actually looking for investors to go into it, and Nebula wants to do that, but we need to show Nebula and potential investors that it's worth it. So if you're at all curious about my movie, please sign up for Nebula, especially using the Identities link, because it could actually fulfill a dream of mine. Not that making a movie is not its own form of dream, and has been absolutely amazing. I'll talk about all that at another time in another video over on my main channel, and also on this channel I have a special video coming out tomorrow that's a little surprise for Identities, so be on the lookout for all that. But let's actually talk about what you're here for. Enough about my stuff going on. Let's talk about Day. So, I have been a pretty good defender of the Acolyte, and I know you can hear the butt coming. I've been a defender of the Acolyte overall so far. Well, I've had some wonkiness with it. I don't think it's like a knockout of the park as I kind of hoped it would be. I have been relatively enjoying it. That being said, because it's Star Wars, and Star Wars is just this culture war zeitgeist thing, it has been endlessly frustrating to just see the conversation around this show week to week to week, just be always taken over by the culture war bullshit nonsense of like, oh, they hate white dudes, or oh, it's ridiculous, and people using the CinemaSins esque mindset of, oh, let's just nitpick this thing to hell to say it's bad, and then when we use those nitpicks to say it's bad, then we can tie it into other culture war nonsense of like, oh, it's gone woke or whatever, it's bad because the nitpicking's gone woke, and really, I've been finding the show can have interesting ideas, not always executed perfectly, but always having interesting ideas, and that's been kind of pulling me through a lot of the show. And I give that entire preface, and I think I need to give that entire preface, especially here on YouTube, considering all that toxicity that is around the show, because I have to say that this is the first episode, really, where the cool ideas of the show did not carry me through the things that I found frustrating with it. That being said, there are a lot of things I do like about this episode, but just some of the execution felt a little bit either quick, stilted, or had me questioning, why would you do it this way? Or just felt like it didn't naturally follow one-to-one. And it just feels like there could have been some smoothing out of a lot of the elements here, and I would have loved it, because everything on paper here I really, really like. It's just the execution that is not bad. I have seen certainly bad executions of things. They just kind of fall a little bit flat for me. I think the big example of this, and to get into specifics, is the opening scene. We have May, and I don't even know her name, though I love her performance. I think she's actually one of the strongest performances in the show, the Padawan. And we get this conversation between the two of them of like, oh, we're friends, we bonded, and now I have to leave. And Osha in this conversation continually reiterates the same beat of like, I'm not a Jedi, I have to leave. It just kind of is said a few times in that very Star Wars wonky-esque George Lucas prequel era dialogue way. And also, I don't really buy that these two are friends yet. Not that I don't think their chemistry is great, and there's a later scene in this episode that I actually think works really well for their, building on their friendship that we get told here. but we never really saw them bonding much in the previous 2 episodes that we've seen them in this show. They only had like 1 episode that they were kind of hanging out together, I think episode 2, and in that they don't really have a lot of friend bonding time. So I don't really buy this friendship that apparently happened in between scenes, and it seems to be pulling on an emotional buy-in that I don't have yet, even if they just had like a scene of them just bonding as people, but we don't really have enough of that to really hook into, so it doesn't land for me, especially since we had the flashback episode last episode in between this to make me sort of make me feel even more distance from any type of relationship that they did have in episode 2, even if they did have a few moments. So it just feels very distant to be pulling on that thread. And then we get to, let me just talk about May and Kamir, I think is his name, Jason from The Good Place. I'll call him in case I don't screw up his name. I do find Kamir to be a really interesting character. He definitely he has this vibe of, he does care for May. He like seemingly does really care. But is also pushing her to be like, you know, how do you think about this? Like, what are you doing? When he's like, I loved this discussion of like, why is he making you kill with a Jedi without a weapon? It must be a test of some kind. And she says, no, it's a lesson. And she thinks about it being, it's an impossible task. Like the Jedi don't kill anyone that's unarmed. So how do you kill someone that's unarmed? It's an impossible task. And that's her way of thinking about it. And certainly Kamir is guiding her towards a point of view. Now, I'm going to say this right up front. This may be a spoiler, but I have to say this. Like, there's other potential candidates for who the Sithy guy, May's master is throughout the show so far. But I really think Kamir is the #1 option. I mean, we see he leaves May for a few minutes to go get water, apparently, and then May later on finds the Wookiee dead. He's been killed already. So I just imagine he probably left, went and killed the Wookiee guy, came back, pretended to be Kamir, and then when Kamir's tied up, we see the Sith guy come in at the end to attack them at the end of the episode. I'm like, come on, that's definitely Kamir. It has to be, like, maybe it's someone else, but he is the top of the list for me right now. The conveniences of, like, when he lines up to be not being available in this episode and when other things happen, like the Wookiee getting killed, it's a 1-for-1. So I think that's where the show is leading us to. But I do really like their May and Kamir's bond. What didn't work for me was May's sudden desire to turn herself in, join, and like give herself into the Jedi and see Osha. Now, the reason it doesn't work for me, again, this comes down to execution, where on paper, I could buy a change of heart from Meg, where she feels things are impossible, and now she's seen her sister and she changed her mind. But it's such a hard 180, where she's suddenly like, oh, the Jedi that I've been killing, I'll turn myself into them. She's part of the Jedi. Like, she must know something. Like, I buy her having a bond with her sister and wanting to see her sister, even though her sister tried to shoot her at the end of episode 2. I just don't buy this complete willingness to betray everything that she's known and join the people, or at least turn herself into the people that she has been murdering for the past few episodes, and sort of trusting that. It just felt like way too much of a 180 for me to buy, and I wish there had been like a little bit more nuance in there to be like, I don't necessarily trust the Jedi, but I trust Osha, and I do want to see her, and I want to talk to her. So maybe it's less like, I want to turn myself into the Jedi, and more, I want to go and talk to Osha. That is more my priority than killing these Jedi. That would have felt more believable. It's just the complete 180 here that just does not work for me. Another thing to praise about this episode that I did like was the creepiness of the forest. The tension they built up with that was great. The sequence where we got like the little flying dung beetle things, I think the Ubermoss they said in the subtitles, something like that. I thought that was suitably creepy, this idea of there being a blight on this forest. It gave me very much Mirkwood vibes from Lord of the Rings. And Mirkwood is one of my favorite like parts of that story. Like, I have a Hobbit tattoo for a reason. I have it right here on my shoulder here, Smaug the Dragon. And my favorite, because it's my favorite book, and my favorite part of that book is Mirkwood. I love creepy horror, like creepy forest horror stuff. So like leaning into that a little bit here with this episode, I was down for it, and I think they nailed that kind of perfectly. I really did enjoy that vibe. And I also like the fact that it was drawn to the lightsaber. It's like a moth to a flame. It just goes right into the lightsaber. I think that's kind of funny, and fits. And just gave the creepiness. But to throw a negative back out at this, the Yord stuff. We have these sequences with Yord sort of talking with Osha. And the second scene I actually really liked, where there's talking with each other, you're sort of being like, look, when we were younglings, we bonded, you always had this wound with May, like she was always this thing that you were holding on to, and then that even leading into the conversation that Osha has with the Padawan, where she's like, we are not what we lost, we are what we survive, and it kind of shows like the limitations of Yord's worldview versus the Padawan, who has a little bit more of an open mind and more empathetic heart than Yord does, versus with Yord's very like, I follow the letter of the law all the time, and not necessarily the spirit of it. And yet still shows Yord's compassion for Osha. He does still care for her. It is unfortunate, though, that scene is preceded immediately by this scene where he demands the blaster from Osha. And I just was sitting there after that scene being like, what was the point of that scene? We already know Yord's kind of a dick. We got even that earlier this episode at the sequence where he's giving his presentation. He's kind of a little bit rude to Osha, where he just says civilian. We got a sense that he's a dick, right? We've already got that from previous episodes and in this episode. And we get in the other scene that he does still have some humanity, for lack of a better word, within him for Osha. So those two aspects are well highlighted in this episode and previously. And so this sequence where we have him wanting to take the blaster, I'm like, what was the episode trying to communicate to me? That Yord's a big dick? Just an even worse dick? And it's immediately it not only makes me dislike Yord more because he's somewhat unreasonable. Even in his, like, wanting to follow the letter of the law. Like, he's like, oh, it's owned by the Jedi, so we need to take it back. Like, I get the beat they're trying to hit there, like, he follows the Jedi over Osha. But it just makes him come off as even more of a dick than I think the show necessarily wants me to view him as, because it undercuts that dickishness in that scene, undercuts the very next scene we have with him, where he's being somewhat empathetic to her, and it just pulls me away from him. So, yeah, I like Yord as a character. I think that he's used effectively for what he is when he's done well. But that scene in particular, like, I get what they were going for, but it just makes me dislike him. And that is unfortunate because, again, it's just a little, like, execution things. Another element to just to talk about before we get to the big thing at the end is the Jedi Council stuff. We get a little bit of this going on with, like, them sort of talking about, like, they're being trained. So I guess they do not know what the Sith are at this point in the timeline. I guess they sort of call it, like, is this a splinter order? Like, those are all interesting little world-building things. The scene plays out a little bit wonky to me. Like, the dialogue is, again, very stilted and a little bit stiff. But it works out fine. The thing of that scene that does interest me the most is the, I forget her name, but the Green Master lady. She basically says, we don't want to go to the council with this because the council will have to tell the Senate, and that'll cause a whole scandal. And we don't want to deal with that. And it's just interesting to me to just see, like, the politics mindset going on in the Jedi here. Especially her, like, she has this, she's less about, like, the spirituality of everything going on and more about, like, what's the politics here? Can we just do this unilaterally without having, governmental oversight? That is a really interesting aspect of this that we don't get a ton of exploration of here. But always the wanting to, like, my favorite aspect of any, like, big universe science fiction thing is, like, what are the politics going on with this universe? And that little piece of world building was a little fascinating to me. So that was an interesting little nugget that was going on here. Osha herself, her story arc this episode is fine to me. She's very much like I just don't want to deal with it anymore. I don't want to, like, be involved. And then she sort of was like, if I am going to be involved, like, I really, like, you need to take her down because I don't trust her at all. That follows very much from episode 3 and, like, her distrust of May and the perspective she has on May. So all of that makes sense to me. It was fairly, like, nothing too tight, but I did really like that. It does seem they're trying to draw her back into the Jedi aspect of things. Like, she was able to sense the moth and then it died immediately, so she regrets that. And I love the Padawan saying, like, again, I don't necessarily know if I agree, but the Padawan's view as a Jedi being like, oh, it's always an honor to view something going back to the Force. It's like, the Jedi were the ones to kill it, though. So is it an honor if you're the one bringing it back to the Force? And that kind of mentality, while somewhat beautiful in this Padawan's mindset in a pure way, can very much be used to justify atrocities. It's like, we're just returning people back to the Force so we can kill them, which I wouldn't be surprised as maybe mindset plays a little bit into what happened to Osha and May's, sisters, coven family that we saw last episode. Maybe that was sort of the impetus for at least some justification for what Trinity Jedi wanted to do last episode, or back in the past. So just little tidbits like that are interesting to me. I do appreciate that. But all this leads us to the end of the episode where Weird Sith Guy, shows up after the Wookiee has been killed, and May is like, shit, he's here, so great. I just decided to betray him at the moment where he's closest to me. I've picked a bad time. And he shows up and starts attacking them. Will say his appearance in the background of that shot, creepy as all hell. Loved the turn to darkness, like the light fading out, was perfect. Like, the filmmaking on all of that was fantastic. Creepy, and just building that off of that tension of the forest stuff, all really, really, really good. Then we start this fight, and I was like, ready. It's like, oh my god, we're getting a Sith versus like a bunch of Jedi fighting. He's gonna kick their ass, Palpatine style, and hopefully better than Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. Then there's like weird spinny move that he does in that movie. I was all pumped and ready, and then cut to credits. And I was watching this with my partner. She's downstairs right now watching another show, watching House of the Dragon. And she turned to me. She was so upset. Because she's like, what? This is a 30-minute episode. You could have had 10 more minutes of the fight. And hopefully we'll get that fight beginning of next episode. But it really just feels anticlimactic here. I don't know. Like, I get that the show probably wanted to end on a cliffhanger and have like, ooh, this is a big fight. But it really just feels like you just cut me off right when I was getting excited. Like, right when it feels like there's a climax to this episode. And again, I understand cliffhangers are a thing. I understand that there's probably maybe structurally to work out a little bit better once I see next episode. But all I can say for my review of this episode on its own terms, without having seen ahead of this, it feels anticlimactic. And I am a little bit like, man, I wish we could have seen more. Like, I wish we could have seen more. I wish I could have gotten more of that, and not in a way that feels satisfying. It feels more like, man, I wish you'd given 10 more minutes to this 30-minute episode, and make it a full episode, like a full normal length episode, and make me feel like I've seen this whole thing to completion. Because presumably, however that fight ends, there's going to be some status quo change. Maybe a character dies, a character gets kidnapped, or something. He's angry, like, even if it's just like he gets May and he's now pissed off at May, and everyone else survives. Like, I doubt that that's going to be the case, but presumably, and that might have been a more interesting emotional cliffhanger than this sort of like cut me off at the knees, sort of like, I want there to be a little bit more here. So yeah, I ultimately have to land on this where I've kind of landed on most of the Acolyte, which is there's a lot of really cool ideas in this episode that I really do enjoy. And I really appreciate that clearly everyone who's working on this show has put a lot of thought into the lore and philosophy and concepts that they're playing with this era of Star Wars. Like, I think all of that is shining through and great. It's just the actual storytelling execution level is fine to sometimes wonky. And it's never outright horribly bad, but it never really transcends into something fantastic. And that really feels like what's holding it back. It kind of makes me think about, I think the prequels are somewhat better in terms of some of their filmmaking aspects, which is saying something, but it kind of reminds me a lot about the prequels, which is the prequels have a lot of really interesting philosophy, a lot of really interesting ideas, a lot of really interesting concepts. Honestly, complex that are more complex and interesting than arguably the original trilogy. But they aren't portrayed with the level of filmmaking craft that the original trilogy did have. And this show is reminding me a little bit of that, where it's like a lot of great ideas, a lot of good philosophy, a lot of good concepts and stuff going on here. But it doesn't necessarily hit as hard as it could because there's just a little bit of filmmaking wonkiness going on. And there are moments of greatness, like the darkness at the end of this episode when the Sith guy shows up. Like those filmmaking aspects, phenomenal. But they're the exception rather than the rule. And it sucks to say that because, again, that aspect of things is what the culture warrior, outrage merchants use to dismiss all of it. It frustrates me. This is the last thing I'll end on because I don't want to get into this whole diatribe. This will probably end up being what the comments end up being about because I'll talk about this. But it really frustrates me when there are these problems filmmaking wise that in another show that the culture warrior nonsense people love they would completely ignore. They would say, they would ignore it. But they nitpick it here so that they can then ultimately dismiss the interesting ideas that the show has. It's like, oh, you should have never questioned the Force. How dare they question Anakin not being a special little boy anymore? How dare they question the Jedi Orders, this perfect idea? Like, they should never do that. These SJW, woke warrior, whatever nonsense stuff. Like, they'll use these nitpicks than any other thing they would dismiss. And it's just frustrating because I end up sitting here, you know, trying to be like, I think these are interesting ideas, but I do think that they could have been portrayed better. But when I say that, then that'll just lead those culture warrior assholes to be like, see, even she agrees that it's trash, which I don't. I'm trying to critique. And critique involves looking at the good and looking at the bad in equal measure and trying to come up with your own opinion and consensus on what you're thinking about it and how it portrays its ideas. Unfortunately, that might be a little bit too nuanced for some of the assholes. Anyways, that's enough of my diatribe on them. I wonder what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear all of them down below in the comments. Let me know. Beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends... before I dismiss, please, if you can, sign up for Nebula to see my movie next week. It's coming very, very soon. Check out the video that I'll be having out tomorrow, or maybe even the time of this uploading today, the Wednesday of this week. We have a special video on this channel, not my main channel. That'll be something a little bit special for identities. And beyond all that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.